They were hometown boys.
As Virginians, we like to hold them in complete awe, and they were pretty impressive people.
Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, both Virginians, grew up in a time when dreams of Western exploration became reality. And it all started here.
It's Albemarle County, where this peculiar constellation of intellects came together in the 1750s to start this planning process.
As our nation commemorates the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition, Virginians celebrate the roots of the journey and consider its legacy today.
Production funding for Virginia's Lewis and Clark is made possible in part by Albemarle County, the Charlottesville-Albemarle Convention and Visitors Bureau, the City of Charlottesville, and the University of Virginia.
A close look at the Lewis and Clark story reveals how deeply this journey was rooted in Albemarle County soil. Even today, there's much that the adventurers would recognize. The Rivanna River, the Blue Ridge Mountains, even their family homesteads, all of which served as a backdrop to their everyday lives and formed much of their expectations regarding the expedition west. While they would perhaps marvel at Charlottesville's bustling urban center, Lewis and Clark would see their dreams and visions still flourishing in the people and places of Charlottesville and Albemarle County. Both Thomas Jefferson and Meriwether Lewis were born in what is now Albemarle County, which lies east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, in an area that Jefferson described as the Eden of the United States for its climate and fertility.
It's not hard to see why he felt that way. It's really a remarkable place.
It is as beautiful and restful and peaceful an area as I've ever been, not only in the United States, but just about anywhere.
The first settlers who came to Albemarle County, I'm surprised that anybody went any further.
Jefferson's father and the grandfathers of Lewis and his expedition partner, William Clark, were among the first settlers of this area, establishing plantations here in the 1730s. These men were from prominent Tidewater, Virginia families, and they bought up fertile Crown land near the Southwest Mountains. Among the first was Nicholas Meriwether, who patented a huge tract of almost 20,000 acres on the east side of this ridge. Jonathan Clark got a grant for part of a 3,000-acre tract on the other side of the ridge. And farther west, Robert Lewis patented about 10,000 acres. And then there was Peter Jefferson, who received a patent for more than 1,000 acres on the Rivanna River, which included the small mountain which became Monticello. Jefferson had a lifelong fascination with the West, and his influence on Meriwether Lewis in this way is known to all of us, but I think it's also interesting to consider what were the influences on Jefferson. What part did Albemarle County play in this persistent dream of exploring the West?
Albemarle County in the 1750s was really a hotbed of speculative inquiry into the Western country.
First, there was Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, who with his close friend Joshua Fry surveyed boundaries westward across the Blue Ridge Mountains and came back with leadership and courage that were still being told by his great-grandchildren a century later. Another friend of Peter Jefferson's, Dr. Thomas Walker of Castle Hill, was the first white explorer to cross the Cumberland Gap, and he actually named it, reaching what is now Kentucky and Tennessee.
These gentlemen purchased land on the east bank of the Mississippi River and were going to use it as a staging ground for an expedition they were going to send up the Missouri River, which in the 1750s was viewed by Virginians as the logical route to get from Atlantic to Pacific.
Now, this project was killed by the French and Indian War, but the Reverend James Morey thought this a grand scheme, as he said, and he was still talking about it enthusiastically years later when Thomas Jefferson was attending his school in the north part of the county.
Now, Jefferson at the time is a boy. He's 10, 11, 12 years old. But we know that he was of an inquiring mind. We know that he was a very bright boy. And I can't imagine that he wouldn't have known about this, that he wouldn't have had some inkling of these plans. Really, of all the places in the colonies, in the English colonies, it's Albemarle County where this peculiar constellation of intellects came together in the 1750s to start this planning process. And I think this is where the genesis of Thomas Jefferson's ideas for a transcontinental water communication for the purpose of commerce begins.
The stories told by these Albemarle County men really fed the imagination of the young Thomas Jefferson, who dreamed of exploring what he called the Great Western Wilderness.
And he would do this in an imaginary sense, and that was enough for him. He would always try to get somebody else to do the actual physical journey.
He never went further west than Hot Springs, which is within the boundaries of the present state of Virginia. Instead, he sent or tried to send off other men into the unknown, off the edge of maps.
He was a vicarious Westerner. That's a phrase that the numbers have used about Jefferson, was the vicarious Westerner. He had access to the best information that was available at almost any point in his life. He could have put his hands on the best books and the best maps. He had the great French travel accounts, Hennepin. He had the great French maps, Guillaume Delisle's maps and Dupratz's maps, along with Dupratz's History of Louisiana. And this was his geography of the imagination. As early as the 1780s, he's thinking about the Western expedition. Invites first George Rogers Clark to participate in this, and that doesn't work. Rogers Clark declines on grounds of health. And when he finally was in a position to make this happen, he made it happen. And he did so with Meriwether Lewis, and later William Clark added to the complex.
Thomas Jefferson had a personal acquaintance with Meriwether Lewis, owing from his being of my neighborhood, according to Jefferson. In fact, Lewis was born just 10 miles from Monticello at Locust Hill, his father's farm in Ivy Depot.
Although Locust Hill got its name from the abundance of the locust trees that grew on the property in the years that Meriwether Lewis was here, this tree is an Osage orange, which was reportedly brought back to Charlottesville by Meriwether when he came back from his expedition.
Lucy Meriwether Lewis and Colonel William Lewis lived with their 3 children, Jane, Meriwether, and Reuben, at Locust Hill until William's death in 1779. 6 months after her husband's death, Lucy Lewis married Captain John Marks, and they moved the family to Broad River Valley, Georgia. After her second husband's death, Lucy eventually moved back to Albemarle and ran the farm at Locust Hill.
She rode a horse and was like the local medicine woman, and of course 6,000 acres in those days was huge, and she ministered to all the sick people that worked on the plantation. And one day a hunting party went out, supposedly to bring back venison, and she was having a big dinner, and while they were gone, there was a deer who actually was here in the yard, and I can attest that that happens on a daily basis, and she and the help in the house trapped the deer in the corner, killed it, and when the hunting party returned, she was already preparing the venison, and they came home empty-handed. I'm not a part of history, but I can relive in my imagination what it must have been like for Meriwether Lewis as a young man to wake up and look out of the window and see the mountains and wonder what was on the other side.
The southwestern mountains were the first mountain range Albemarle settlers encountered, coming from tidewater in the east. On the eastern slopes of this range is where land was first patented in this area, including the 1730 Nicholas Meriwether II land grant from England's King George II.
We don't know exactly who built the original Nicholas Meriwether Grant house. The structure that we have an image of, the daguerreotype, dates from the 1760s, and it is believed that that's the house that Lucy Meriwether Lewis Marks probably grew up in, and her cousin William Douglas Meriwether, lived in all of his life.
While the Marks family lived in Georgia, Meriwether came back to Albemarle to receive a classical education.
For the time that Lewis was here, William D. took charge of his education, and he went to the Reverend Maury School just down the road, about 8 miles from here. I'm a steward for my time here. It's still in the same family. I think that's a record of stewardship. It's still lived in and loved by a lot of people, a lot of family members. We hope that that will go on for another 11 generations, if not forever.
The Clark family had always been on the forefront of Western expansion, first settling in King and Queen County, Virginia, in the early 17th century. John Clark III married Anne Rogers in 1749, and the couple moved to a 410-acre estate in Albemarle County on the Rivanna River. 4 of the Clark family children were born here, including George Rogers. In the mid-1750s, the family moved to Caroline County, where the last 6 children were born, including William.
This is where the Clarks lived. They had a normal farm, had children here, and moved on. The foundation for this cabin was found by the folks who owned the property before my family when they were farming. My father wanted to be accurate, historically correct, so he looked for a cabin or log house that was of the period. He finally found this particular log house, which is very similar in size and shape to the foundation. It was the miller's house at the Walker Mill in a different part of Albemarle County. He had it completely disassembled and reassembled on site, and my mother actually had it open as a museum with artifacts in farming equipment, hunting equipment, that would have been something the Clark family would have had in their home. As Virginians, we like to hold them in complete awe, and they were pretty impressive people.
Thomas Jefferson knew the Lewis, Meriwether, and Clark families as neighbors and friends. Meriwether's uncle, Nicholas Lewis, managed Jefferson's affairs during his diplomatic service in Paris. When Jefferson was about to assume the office of the presidency, he knew whom he wanted as his private secretary.
After his election as president in 1801, Jefferson invited Lewis to be his private secretary, which was more an aide-de-camp than an actual clerical worker. And they lived together in the presidential mansion in Washington, as Jefferson said, like 2 mice in a church. And I like to think of the 2 of them in the evening, perhaps, talking about their family and mutual friends back in Albemarle County, recalling the exploits of Dr. Thomas Walker, who was Lewis's kinsman as well as Jefferson's guardian, and reminiscing about the Maury School, which they both attended, and about going back into the Southwest Mountains behind the school on hunting and exploring expeditions.
The next thing Jefferson does is to go to Congress and ask for money to support an expedition. Why does he do that when he does it? Well, he goes to Congress essentially a month and a half after he's read Alexander Mackenzie's book, Travels from Montreal. And he says in correspondence, the British are winning. The British and their fur trade have already established a line of water communication across the continent, but much of that is in high latitudes, locked up by ice for a good part of the year. If we can establish a route by way of the Missouri River, which according to the best accounts offers but a single portage to the waters of the Pacific Ocean, we can sort of tap off that British fur trade. So Jefferson goes to Congress and he asks for money, gets it, a princely sum of $2,500, and immediately thereafter he sets Lewis to work, planning, figuring out what they're going to need to take along, how many people are going to be involved. Lewis is sent to Monticello to read books and to study maps in Jefferson's collection. They hire a Washington cartographer to draft the sort of composite map that essentially is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of exploration, in the sense that we have a map which says to us, this is what Jefferson and Meriwether Lewis thought the West was like in 1803. So this is a lengthy planning process, and it really goes from sort of late in 1801 all the way down to the mid part of 1803, by which time Lewis is prepared, ready to leave. He's written to Clark, asked Clark to join him. Then, of course, the purchase of Louisiana occurs, and it changes the nature of the expedition in the American mind somewhat, but it's still the same expedition that it would have been, in the sense that their main objective was to find this water connection across the continent for commercial purposes that will not only drain off that British trade from the north, but will establish the United States as a continental power with links on both coasts.
On July 4th, President Jefferson and his secretary participated in the festivities of the day in Washington. The next morning, Captain Meriwether Lewis left the nation's capital with Jefferson's letter of instructions and 3 generations of dreams of Western exploration. He then met with fellow Virginian William Clark, and together they led the Corps of Volunteers on an expedition of northwestern discovery. As Jefferson wrote on the eve of the expedition, "We shall delineate with correctness the great arteries of this great country. Those who come after us will fill up the canvas we begin." In the 200 years since he sent his confidential letter to Congress, Jefferson's vision of a rising nation spread over a wide and fruitful land, advancing rapidly to destinies beyond the reach of mortal eye, has indeed come true.
We know more today about the results of Lewis and Clark than President Jefferson ever had the advantage of. And so in some ways, Lewis and Clark has become more important historically than it was in Jefferson's lifetime, and certainly in the years that followed Jefferson. We were really fortunate at Monticello to have the opportunity to be selected as the kickoff event for the Lewis and Clark commemoration.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to Monticello, where the journey began, and to the official commencement of the National Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Commemoration.
Across the divide of 2 centuries, the story of Lewis and Clark still speaks to us today. We can find inspiration in their perseverance and courage. We can applaud and perhaps even try to emulate their bond of friendship and community. And each day, we can still learn something personally from Lewis and Clark. Every day is a day of discovery.
What was really interesting about this entire process is that this was not a commemoration event or
a single activity. It was really, for us, a community experience. In a way, it was a wonderful opportunity for all of us to really get to know one another and work together. And we have a better sense of our own history and where we want to go in the future. Lewis and Clark is an opportunity for us to really embrace our history more fully. For me personally, the biggest lessons learned are re-familiarizing myself, or learning for the first time in most cases, about the tribes.
Today, the Charlottesville-Albemarle region is a thriving economic and cultural community, a place both hectic and idyllic, urban and pastoral. Its Jeffersonian ideals exist not only at the University of Virginia and Monticello, but seem to permeate many facets of daily life. Meriwether Lewis, William, and George Rogers Clark also have not been forgotten. They are a part of Albemarle history that is inseparable from the Albemarle of today.
I feel very much a part of history, and passing the history on to another generation is what's been done, and we need to keep doing that or it will be lost.
You want to kill that buffalo to eat, right? Okay, now brandish firearms, aim, fire!
I'm Captain Lewis.
This is Captain Clark.
He's born in Albemarle. I'm born in Caroline County. Yeah, my brother, you've probably heard of George Rogers Clark, the conqueror of the Northwest during the American Revolutionary War. And he grew up here in Albemarle, and then the family moved to Caroline. President Jefferson said, be students, and that's what we were. We tried to learn as much as we could about the people of the West. I don't know how we made it. Divine providence, I guess.
It's very important that we teach children to love adventure and love history. And we've got plenty of that here in Albemarle County.
This is the Lewis and Clark keelboat. It's a replica of their boat, and we've been working on it for the past year.
You want to get an apprentice boat builder badge, you go through and hammer a couple of nails.
Hey, you betcha.
You can start either way.
I want to start right over there.
All sorts of different kinds of things.
There you go.
They'll start you right down there.
We got this idea several years ago after Stephen Ambrose's book came out. A couple of us thought, Lewis and Clark, they are hometown boys here, and we should be celebrating their origins here in Charlottesville. So it really built from there, and we decided that we wanted to commemorate the Lewis and Clark expedition as the trip west began here. I think what's going to be so wonderful about having this center here is learning not only about the voyage of discovery and what Lewis and Clark did, but how that is an ongoing voyage.
I think the Lewis and Clark core of discovery should teach each of us that there really is no mountain too high, that we should work together in community.
I think as we become more urbanized and more paved over in this country, the stories are even more distant. The Lewis and Clark expedition captivates the imagination of a lot of people. They become interested in history because of it, then that's a great legacy that survives.
I have been fascinated why people are so passionate about Lewis and Clark. I think part of this energy comes from the fact that it's truly a heroic story. It has courage, it has exploration, it has a really interesting cast of characters. And one of those characters, we're proud to say, was President Jefferson, whose vision this was.
To purchase a VHS copy of this program, send a check for $21.95 to the address on the screen, or call 434-295-7671.
Production funding for Virginia's Lewis and Clark is made possible in part by Albemarle County,